Hi, Ron Hoffer from the World Bank. A couple of questions. A lot of the political enthusiasm or response for to climate change came from the last Ipcc report. And the Ipcc, when they came out the last report, they were not so much in the spotlight as they are now. What are your views on the likely findings of the next Ipcc report? Will it sort of be the spur for action? And then the second question is, clearly changes, if you project, if they're gradual, perhaps society can adjust, but if they're sporadic and catastrophic, there's more problems in that regard. Again, any views on that one would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, on the first one, of course, the Ipcc has been in the news because it's because of an error, and that was, of course, saying that all the Himalayan glaciers would melt by 2030, or 2035. Truly stupid. Anyone knows anything about glaciers in the Himalayas knows that most of them won't melt for hundreds of years. The mistake was a problem, but it wasn't the mistake. I mean, one sentence being completely wrong in 3,000 pages is a pretty high standard. There were probably 5 other sentences in the last report that should have been more carefully worded. Agricultural productivity in North Africa, an issue about the forests in Amazon. They could have been slightly better worded. They weren't wrong, but they could have been nuanced a bit better. What was wrong, unfortunately, was the way IPCC handled it by first defending the error on Himalayan glaciers, and it brought them into total disrepute. The recent Inter-Academy Council, however, has made some fairly simple suggestions of how to regain trust in the IPCC, and I'm actually hoping that the IPCC will take into account not all of the recommendations, because I think a couple are not right, but many, if not most of the recommendations. It's basically tightening up the principles and procedures largely. What will the next IPCC report say? Obviously, that would be prejudging it. But all the information since the last IPCC report that came out in 2007 has actually strengthened the case for human-induced climate change, not weakened it. So all the trends are such that the Earth is still warming. There's no evidence it's anything but human-induced. So at the moment, what you would have actually, if anything, would be a strengthened IPCC report if it came out today. I'd say we'd be more concerned about the Greenland ice sheet today than they were in 2007. We'd be asking a few more questions about why the Arctic sea ice is melting as quickly as it is. May not be due to human activity. It could be part of a natural cycle. So I've seen nothing in the literature to date that would undermine the conclusions of the fourth report and strengthen it. Now, will they be acted upon? That's a totally different question. I would argue until the US starts to take this issue seriously, why would any other country? The US has some of the highest, not the highest, but some of the highest per capita emissions in the world. China's emissions now exceed the US, but of course they've got 5 times the population. So on a per capita basis, they're 5 times less responsible. Equally, if you look at the historical emissions, the US has put in 27% of greenhouse gas emissions, China 9%. So when you think of what is fair and equitable, what should China do, what should the US do, because the two together now are over 50% of global emissions, or about 50% of global emissions, there's a major equity issue there, basically, and this is going to be the challenge. So I would argue until the US starts to move forward, I think it'll be very hard to see India, China, Brazil, South Africa, other major developing countries really make a radical change. Now, China, I would have to say, is trying to do a lot. They're already fairly committed to renewable energy. They're trying to put some end-use efficiency standards in transportation as good as the Japanese, who are the world leaders at the moment. But the point is, China's got an incredible, insatiable demand for energy to fuel its economic growth. But it's not all, of course, for domestic consumption. China is basically providing much of the goods and services for the rest of the world. I made the front page of the British newspapers a couple of weeks ago, and they said, hey, aren't we doing well in England? Our emissions are 22% below 1990 levels. Really a major success. However, was the next sentence, and it made the radio and television and the front of the newspapers. I said, however, if you take embedded carbon, the difference between what we import versus export in finished products, We're not minus 22%, we're plus 12%. In other words, we haven't changed one diddly iota, basically. And I would guess that's probably similar for most European countries. And I would guess the plus 15 to 20% number in the US is really plus 30 or 40% if you take embedded emissions. In other words, we can't blame China for its growth. Some is for domestic consumption. A lot of it is the export market. They're fueling the industrial demand, the demand for industrial goods in the US and in Europe, basically, in other parts of the world. So we have to look very carefully at what China's doing and why it's doing it, and look to see what we're doing, certainly in the UK, and I would ask also in the US. So I don't know whether people will act on the next IPCC report. What I'm optimistic about, well, no. What we will need is an unholy consortia of different interest groups who all want to move the climate change forward. Part of the religious right in the US is very concerned with this particular issue, the evangelical movement, that we're basically destroying God's creation. Therefore, action should be taken. We're seeing some of the large companies say, boy, if indeed we're transitioning to a low-carbon economy in Europe and Japan, we can't afford to be left behind because the big markets are in developing countries. So the private sector might be a drive. But of course, what happened here a couple of weeks ago with the Democrats losing the House and almost losing the Senate, that does not bode well for moving the climate change debate forward in the US, which then means you can't be too optimistic about moving the climate debate forward internationally.
No, we've got at least one more question. Is there anybody else who has a burning question? Or we can take two, I think. Okay. First you and then
I don't know if it's burning, but Phil Byer from Toronto. You show a wide range of some of the projections, for example, in temperature 3 to 6 degrees, on precipitation and so on. Is there a general view about when we will see a significant divergence in the projection? In other words, when we might know or have a good feel that we're going towards 6 or going to stay toward 3? And when might that be?
Yeah. Well, if I knew the answer to that one, I'd be in great shape. It's the right question, obviously. There are two factors that basically sort of underpin a projection. Let's simplify it to temperature change. One is, what are the emission scenarios? And I say that doesn't matter up to about 2035, but it does matter beyond 2035. So the uncertainties in the climate projection is uncertainty in the scenarios, especially past the first few decades, and uncertainty in understanding the climate system. And we have a very simple parameter called the climate sensitivity factor, which simply says, hypothetically, if you were to quickly double the atmospheric abundance of carbon dioxide, how would the Earth's temperature respond? And 20 years ago, we said it would respond by a minimum of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase and a maximum of 4.5. So 1.5 to 4.5, a factor of 3, central value being 3. It's exactly the same today. We got a much better understanding of cloud physics, a much better understanding of aerosol effects, a much better understanding of the hydrological cycle, or the exchange of energy between the atmosphere and the ocean, or the atmosphere and the land. But that climate sensitivity factor is still not much less than a factor of 3. When will it change? I really don't know. But that's why in England what we decided was there's going to be no home run to reduce the 1.5 to 4.5 down. So that's why we started doing these probabilistic scenarios of varying. There's 100 factors or so in a model you can vary. Cloud physics models, exchange of energy, what's the indirect or direct effect of aerosols on the atmosphere. So we played around by varying all the parameters to at least come up with a probabilistic distribution, and said to ourselves, if we were going to look at the impacts of climate change on the UK, whether it's on water, food, biodiversity, human health, we had to do it in a very probabilistic manner. Now, some people believe that we don't have enough good information to do a probabilistic scenario at 25 by 25 kilometres, but my view is I personally have reasonable confidence it's a hell of a lot better than not doing it probabilistically and not getting to that spatial scale. In England, one of our big problems is it's a very small island, or great United Kingdom is a small island, and so we have to worry about weird meteorological phenomena called blocking patterns. reasons. The approach we've used would work even better in the United States or any large continental mass. All I can say is there's significant money going into research, both in the US. That's the one thing that the US has done very well, is put money into research on climate. Europe's getting much better, so is Japan, etc. So we have to just keep working away at it, basically, and seeing whether or not we can come up with a probabilistic a probabilistic analysis that suggests, are we going to be closer to the upper end or the lower end, or is the middle still the more likely? And so there's a lot of work going on, but at the moment can't give you a good answer to your question, which says it's a risk management issue.
Last question, Marcia?
Marcia Goldberg, Association of American Geographers. I just wondered, how has population figured in the models? It seems to me with all the drought and famine, population will be going down, and also with the aging of the population and non-replacement in Europe, won't that change some of the configurations you're looking at, so there'll be less human contribution because there'll be fewer people?
Is the answer, and the reason is when the Ipcc first did its various what we call SRES scenarios, which was done 1992, I believe, we had a range of demographic change, population that was a low of 7 billion by 2100 and a high of 15 billion. Now, no one believes the 15 billion number now. I think most demographic projections would suggest that by 2050 we'll be 9.5 billion, and by 2100 we may well have stabilized between 9.5 and 10 billion people, if only because at least to some degree we've partially looked at what happened at the population conference in Cairo in 1992 that argued if you wanted to limit population increase, you should have, the way I read it, three arrows. One was at culturally acceptable forms of contraception, 2 was education of girls, and 3 was empowerment of women. And if you can get those 3 together, you're likely to slow down demographic change considerably, and that's what we're now seeing. So relative to the early projections, I think we're going to have far lower numbers than the high end. But we did explore 7, 10, and numbers above 12. However, to me, the demographic change is important. It's not only total number, it's a little bit almost as you suggest, it's age distribution. The impact depends on family size, it depends if it's in the rural or the urban area. But there's an even bigger factor, and that is the ability to purchase and what we purchase. 5% of the world are Americans, and they consume 25% of all resources, whether it's energy, whether it's water, whether it's biological resources. And so if indeed between now and 2050, the world's population goes up from the high 6s, 6.5, 6.8, whatever the billion people are today, to let's say 9.5, we're going to have a 30-40% increase in numbers. But it's likely when we come out of this recession, world GDP will go up by a factor of 3 or 4 in that same time frame. And indeed, we expect growth to be slightly higher in developing countries such as China, India, Brazil, etc. Therefore, their ability to purchase goes up actually much, much faster than demographic change. So it's really, to me, is the ability to purchase that is a bigger threat to long-term environmental sustainability than demographic change. So it is the 2 factors, but it's the ability to purchase. If most of us in this room doubled our income in the next 10 years, 20 years, we wouldn't eat twice as much, we wouldn't consume twice as much energy. But if you're a poor person living on $1, $1.50, $2 a day, and you were to double your income, you probably would use all of that money either on energy, on food, on fiber, etc. So I think one has to untangle the issue, and that's why I think it's going to be crucial that we find a way to sustainably produce material goods and also recycle them with less material, less energy, etc. So I think it's a consumption issue, which I think will be driven more by economics than it will by demographic change.